Winner of the 2015 Nobel Prize in Economics for his study of poverty, consumption, and welfare, Angus Deaton is the Dwight D. Eisenhower Professor of Economics and International Affairs Emeritus at Princeton University. He is also a scholar at Princeton, as well as a Fellow of the National Academy of Sciences and the British Academy. He is the co-author with his betrothed, Anne Case, of the New York Times bestseller, Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism, and he is the author of The Great Escape, Health, Wealth, and the Origins of Inequality, among other works. Tonight, Professor Deaton will be in conversation with Binyamin Appelbaum, a business and economics editorialist for the New York Times. His earlier work for the Charlotte Observer on subprime lending won a George Polk Award and was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. He is also the author of The Economist's Hour. Please welcome Angus Deaton and Binyamin Appelbaum.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us rather than watching the Phillies. We appreciate it. I see at least one of you has a Phillies cap on, though. So, this is something that I've been looking forward to having an opportunity to talk to Angus about his work for a long time. We were actually scheduled to meet in March 2020 after his last book came out. And as you'll recall, events intervened. There was a little pandemic, and we didn't have the chance to do it then. So I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to do it now.
Thank you. I was looking forward to that too, and I'm very happy to be able to make up tonight.
I guess maybe the place to start is by talking about sort of your view of America, your view as an immigrant to this country. It's very striking to me, if you go back to the mid-19th century, Alexis de Tocqueville's famous account of the United States as a land in which equality was sort of the defining characteristic of the nation. And if you come forward 100 years after that, you still had Europeans coming here and observing that this was a country in which the managers and the workers wore similar clothing, drove similar cars, went to the same churches. But if you come forward to the present, we now have, your account, one I think that many Americans still quite haven't grasped the reality of, that this is now a land of profound inequalities, even more so than Europe. Paint that picture for us. Tell us what you see when you look at this country.
Okay. The working title of the book was Shock and Awe, because and that's something I felt when I first came, and I still feel it today, which there's amazing things in this country to be in awe of. And that just don't exist in Europe in the same way. For my immediate concerns coming here, the best economics was being done in America. That's where the giants were. That had probably not been true. Keynes was in Cambridge once upon a time, but it was clear that America was now taking the lead. And it was also, as it is now, at the very frontiers of technology. The great tech companies, which we're all indebted to and scared of at the same time, Amazon and Apple and Microsoft and Google, are all American firms, and they don't really exist in Europe to anything like the same extent. So it really is the land of opportunity, and amazing opportunity. On the other hand, it's also a place where there's not much of a safety net. And in Europe, there really is a very profound safety net. It's funded by the fact that taxes in Europe are higher. They have a value-added tax, and that yields a lot of revenue, which typically funds the European welfare state. We don't have that here. So it's like what seems to have happened is the high wires have gotten higher, and the safety net has gotten lower and lower. And I think Americans have always felt that was sort of a good trade-off, that there was more opportunity and you took your chances. But the high wire seems to have got higher and higher, and the bodies are piling up underneath. And that is a little terrifying.
We often measure the health of nations in terms of GDP, gross domestic product, who makes the most money, basically. But a more basic measure of nations is how long people live. And you, in your work with NCASE, have pointed out that there's a really stark divide that has emerged in life expectancy. Talk about that. Who dies young in the United States?
Well, first of all, everybody dies young in a sense that, if you draw a picture of life expectancy over time in European countries, and you go back to the 1980s, America was right in the middle of the pack, and the European countries have gone on gaining life expectancy 1.5 years, 2 years every decade. And America has slowly fallen down and fallen out of this group of countries until it's now way hanging off the bottom there. And so who is it that's dying? Well, if you look at people in America with a college degree, a 4-year bachelor's degree, they look like Europeans, and their life expectancy continues to rise. They're doing fine. Maybe not perfectly, but they're doing fine. They look like, in their life expectancy, they look like Swiss or even close to Japan. But if you look at the people without a college degree, they've just fallen off the bottom of this thing to the point where actually since 2010, their life expectancy has actually been falling pretty much every year since 2010. Took a huge hit during the pandemic. People with the BA took a much smaller hit during the pandemic. So you've now got this enormous gap between, there's like two Americas. The America that has a 4-year college degree and the America that doesn't. And unless you're thinking that, everybody has a 4-year college degree, and maybe there's only a few people who don't, 2/3 of the American population does not have a college degree. So we're actually talking about the majority here, and their life expectancy is falling. And, even if the country's doing pretty well in terms of GDP and all these other things, this has got to be a real problem. If we're not living to enjoy it, and something bad is happening. And that's a really worrisome state of America today.
You've described that something bad, at least in part, as a phenomenon that I guess you credit Anne with coining the term deaths of despair to describe it. What does that mean, deaths of despair?
Well, the author of that term is sitting in the audience, Anne Case. I was actually lying in a hospital bed having my hip replaced, and she gave an interview or wrote a piece for Quartz magazine, and her headline was, "Americans are dying of deaths of despair." And we'd done work together a couple of years before that, and we saw that that actually the mortality rates, the fraction of people who were dying for white people in middle age, both men and women, was actually going up. And that's not supposed to happen. It was, of course, a part of this much bigger phenomenon that death rates were going up. And we looked to see, what are people dying of? This is not supposed to happen. And there were 3 causes that were rising very rapidly. And one of those is familiar to everybody, which is opioids. So this horrible opioid crisis that started in the mid-90s was sort of in full swing at that point. The other one was alcoholic liver disease. So people just drinking far too much. And that, along with opioids, got much worse during the pandemic. And the third thing, which is not the biggest of them, but we assign a great deal of importance to, was suicide rates were going up. And suicides, all of these 3 things are to some extent self-inflicted on people. It's not because like COVID or someone runs you over with a car or something. These are things that at some level you're doing to yourself. And that took us right back to reading about suicides, because suicide is the ultimate self-inflicted destruction. And, it's just, if that's happening, just think what sort of despair you must be in. And that's where we picked up, or Anne picked up the term deaths of despair, which seems to have sort of entered the vocabulary since then. And suicide may not be the largest of them, certainly much smaller than opioids, but it was sort of, if people are doing this to themselves, they must be in terrible despair. And then, of course, we linked it back to what's happening to working class people in America, and that, you know, the objective conditions in which they were living was not enabling them to live the sort of good life that they ought to have been living.
Your theory, like any good theory, has generated a lot of critiques, a lot of discussion. I'm not going to put all of the objections to you this evening, but I do want to ask you about one in particular, which is the idea that the cause of this despair is not economic inequality or a lack of opportunity. It is the fact that other groups are finding opportunity, that there is a greater equality between men and women, between whites and minorities, that what people are really angry about, really despairing of, is the end of a social arrangement in which they were privileged.
Well, these deaths of despair are now happening to even groups. When we first wrote, there was very little of this among African Americans or Hispanics, and that's changed. And in some ways, I mean, to talk about African Americans, for reasons that have never been fully explained, they, by and large, don't commit suicide. Much lower suicide rates than whites. And also, I think because of a sort of perverse racism, they were not subjected to the heavy-duty painkillers that were prescribed willy-nilly by doctors to white patients. So they escaped this for a while. Now, once the genie got out of the opioid bottle, as it were, and this stopped being a prescription drug overdose disease epidemic and turned into street drugs, then those communities were affected too. But when we first wrote, and I think the last year of data we had, and that date were 2013, there was no perceptible rise in these deaths among the African American or Hispanic communities. And if you look now, it's everywhere. And the break now is actually much bigger by education than it is by race. So, you know, there used to be this enormous gap between blacks and whites in life expectancy, and that has gotten narrower and narrower. And what's gone wider and wider is the enormous gap between people with a BA and people without whatever race they are. So that has sort of taken over from, and you know, maybe you have a more jaundiced view of human nature than I do, but I think the people who are suffering, they're not just suffering because other people are not suffering enough or they've been taken on. I'm sure there's some of that.
We've been talking to this point really about your work in general and its work that you've covered in some of your earlier books in particular. This new book is more about you and more about your field of study, economics, and raises the interesting question of what role economists may have played in these trends, whether the profession bears some portion of the responsibility for the inequality of life in America. And maybe I'll just read a short bit of it that to me was very striking when you sort of articulate this. You say that economics is weighted toward capital and against labor, that it takes efficiency much more seriously than it takes equity, that power differentials are ignored, and that economics' widespread acceptance bears some responsibility for the diminishing fortunes of workers. I'll say that in general, the book reflects a clear love of your profession, but it's an anguished love, and I think that passage speaks to some of the concerns that you have. What role did economists play in this?
Well, let me come to that in a minute, but not everyone here may know that you wrote a terrific book called The Economist Hour, which I loved when I read it, and I think there's a lot of parallels here. That, you know, economics are very clever people, very clever, we're very good with data, we can count, things like that. But we also have our prejudices, and we have, you know, our politics sometimes, which affects our work. Horror, could you imagine that someone's political beliefs may affect the conclusions they come to, but that's not unknown. And also, I think, we fell too much in a belief in markets. And, markets are sort of central to economics, prices and markets and all these things they do. And, I am an economist, and I'm not going to sit here and say, markets are not important, prices are not important. They're incredibly important, and they're miracles, and they do things so that you can't imagine being done by anyone else. So that's really, really important. But I think we just got too carried away. And so we didn't pay enough attention to the things that markets can't do. And I hope maybe we can talk a bit about the volunteer military, which is something that you started with your book with. And it's a very good example of the economists played an arguable role, but they were certainly there in persuading Dick Nixon, who probably wanted to do it for other reasons as well, to institute an all-voluntary military and pay people instead of... and my guess is that 90% of the economics profession today would still say that was a good idea, because we're not drafting people. Their kids have no chance of having to go to the next war we're fighting. We're paying these people more, and that's probably good. But it's had all sorts of terrible consequences that economists have not been very sensitive to. And I think we're probably on the same page here.
Absolutely. And it's a fascinating example to me because I think much of the American public thinks that the end of the draft during the Vietnam War was brought about by the objections of, would-be draftees and anti-war protesters. And the actual story is that the Nixon administration ended it in part because economists argued compellingly that it would be more efficient to pay people, that it was a waste of Sergeant Elvis Presley to send him to war and much better to pay someone to fight in his stead, and in part because the Nixon administration thought that it could sustain a war more effectively with a paid volunteer army than with a bunch of restive hippies. And that, that's a classic, to me, example of the prioritization of efficiency over equality, and something that, as you say, I think many economists still would favor.
I think so, and I think it's also efficiency, but efficiency in a very narrow goal. So, for instance, one of the things you talk about is members of Congress at that time. Many of them had fought in the armed forces. Many of them had been drafted. They thought of being drafted as part of the social contract. That was part of what being an American was. They knew their kids might be drafted, too. I saw a paper the other day, but I don't remember the numbers. There's almost no members of Congress anymore who have kids that are going to fight in the military. And that's because people like us, the educated people, the people who run the country, by and large, their kids don't have to fight. So, as several people have pointed out, this also makes it much cheaper to fight wars. I mean, you might think twice about voting for a war if your kids were going to go fight in it, or you'd think about it really harder. And also, you've got a military where I think about 82% of the enlisted men and women do not have a college degree or do not have a 4-year college degree. The officers, by and large, nearly all have a BA, but the enlisted men do not. And those enlisted men, we don't know this, but you just wonder how many of them voted for Donald Trump. Those are the people who we would have to trust to put down any rebellion that happened in this country. And I think we're just taking enormous risk here, which we didn't have to take. And this was done because, well, not because necessarily, I don't want to get into that, but economists argued very strongly for this and still do.
Yes. Yeah. I perceive a bit of a tension in the critique of economics in this book. On the one hand, Milton Friedman, the Chicago economist, famously insisted that he couldn't tell the political disposition of an economist by reading their work, which is an absurd claim on its face. Even his wife thought it was an absurd claim. But, as you point out, economists have biases, and acknowledging them would seem to be a healthy thing to do. On the other hand, you point out that it's pretty frustrating that economists can't agree on a measure of inflation, can't agree on a measure of unemployment, can't agree on what should be done during an economic downturn. How do we, on the one hand, reconcile the idea that these biases are real and persistent, and on the other hand, the utility of having a consensus about some of these basic issues?
Yeah. Well, there are good things in there and bad things. I mean, one of the good things is I know a lot of economists who find things that they did not expect to find and who change their minds when they see the numbers, okay? And that's surely got to be a good thing. And I give enormous weight to people whose work has done that consistently. And some of them are conservative, some of them are liberals, some of them are in between. But if people are able to change their mind in the face of the evidence, that's a real positive mark in their favor. So any economist you see doing that, give them a lot of credit. You should listen to what they say. The bit about what you said that I worry about the most is if the data itself get corrupted to the point where, when they were talking about a shutdown last week, next week, many times this is going to happen. One of the things that we're worried about is there would be no data for the Fed to use in order to decide about, what to do. That seems like a really bad thing. But what we have noticed is there's been a tremendous amount of corruption of the data anyway, because the politics and the polarization has become so strong that people are denouncing the data from both sides. And the poor statistical services in the middle who are doing the best they can, but there's no perfection in this thing. Any measure can have legitimate criticisms as well as political criticism. So I think we've now got into a situation where one of my favorite examples is the measurement of poverty in the United States, where, the traditional measure that's been around since the 1960s had a problem in it. And everybody knew there was a problem, including the people, which was that, even including the people at the Census Bureau who were bringing out the data, which is that if you gave poor people money, it didn't have any effect on the poverty rate because we didn't count money that the government gave to people. And so that open season for anyone to come along and make up their own poverty measures. And you have people on the left doing that, and people on the right. My colleague Matt Desmond, who's a terrific writer, and a whole tribe of people who do ethnographic work, they see this poverty on the ground all the time, and they're horrified by it, and they write passionate books, as Matt Desmond has done. Also my colleague Kathy Eden, who does this too. And they see this horror in front of their eyes. And then you go to the American Enterprise Institute, who says, there is no poverty in America. The Trump Council of Economic Advisors said poverty programs in America had been so successful, there was no poverty anymore. And they go ballistic because they're living with people who are suffering the most awful poverty. And yet they can't tell you how much of that there is in the United States because you need a whole statistical system to do that. So we now got a situation where no one believes anything anymore, and everything has been so contaminated with politics. And actually I have a chapter in the book called The Politics of Numbers, which is about that. And there's no basic truth there which can come out and, stand up in front of all this stuff. So that's a very difficult. The global poverty is even worse. Mr. Modi in India has closed down the measurement system, and they're lying about GDP. So these enormous figures you see for India growing at 10% of the year, they're bullshit. He's not sticking by standard international conventional rules for making up these numbers. And so they will not publish the data on poverty anymore. So we've no idea what's happening in India, and about a third of the world's poverty is in India. The Chinese, we've never believed these for many years, though we've evolved ways of dealing with that. So not only in the US, but around the world, we've lost our basic measurement system by which we ought to be judged for what we're trying to do.
I want to put a pin in the point about economists changing their minds because we're going to come back to your own journey in a minute. But Part of what you're talking about is what types of evidence are admissible, and it reminds me of, during the run-up to the 2007 crisis, the Federal Reserve would regularly have groups of visitors who were coming to tell them about the problems in the subprime mortgage market, and these consumer advocacy groups would bring individuals who had lost their homes. And at one of these meetings, the consumer advocacy group said, how many of these people do we need to bring here before you believe that there is a problem? And the chairman of the Fed responded, we're not interested in people, we're interested in data.
That's right.
So what do you do about that? I mean, you talk in the book about the need for economists to open themselves up to other kinds of knowledge. You write that they particularly need to spend more time thinking about philosophy. What are you hoping economists will learn from philosophy? How do you open up economics to other types of knowledge?
Well, I think philosophers can learn a lot from economists too. So, like counting. Counting is a really good thing, being able to count. So once you've got some numbers, whether you believe them or not, it's good to be able to add them up and divide them and put them in a table and so on. And I fight with the philosophers at Princeton over that all the time. And because they tend to think about what should be and propose policies without serious consideration of what those policies would actually do, which we are much better at. And once upon a time, the economists and philosophers used to talk to each other all the time, and that now has seemed to have faded out. But what we can learn from philosophers is philosophers don't think money is everything, and economists tend to think money is everything. And money is very important, but it's not the only thing. And I think a lot of what Anne and I have described in Deaths of Despair is not just people losing their jobs and their salaries, but those communities being destroyed. And so the social clubs that they used to go to are not there anymore. There's no unions in the American private sector. The unions used to supervise factories and help make them safer. They used to represent the workers and give them some power in the workplace. They gave them some power in the local community. They gave them power in Washington. So there's been a huge, economists just don't talk about power. And power is incredibly important. When I was in Britain and was a young man, we hated unions because they were always on strike and they were always in conflict, and it was incredibly inconvenient. But I've come to realize that that's something you have to live with, because those people deserve power too, and that's the way they get to exercise it. So I think I would be more tolerant of that now than I used to be. But we don't think about power. We don't think about community very much. We're very individualistic. So, people's marriages don't seem to matter very much. The people they love and live with and that make our lives worth living are not much thought of in economics. That's changed a little bit, but still. So we need to take a broader view. We need to stop being quite so individualistic. And we have to realize that a lot of things are important beyond money. And, we talked at the beginning about mortality. But that's obviously one of them, but not the only one.
Mm-hmm. This is an example of a broader intellectual journey that you describe in the book, which is that you've come to think that some of the other ways in which we've pursued efficiency, immigration policies, trade policies, may not be a good idea in the form in which they've been pursued. Talk about the arc of your intellectual journey on those issues.
Okay. So the first chapter in the book is about my then young colleagues, David Card and Alan Kruger, who did this new work on minimum wages. And they set out to study, they were going to change the minimum wage in New Jersey, but not in Pennsylvania, and they gathered data before and saw what happened. That was sort of a new thing to do, to look at the individual data, look at the individual McDonald's and see what happened. And they found results that were very counterintuitive and counter to economic theory. And I think we were very enamored of those methods. And there's a lot to be said for those methods. And the economists are now doing much more randomized controlled trials. They have very tighter rules for what is evidence. And let me talk then about one of the issues where they brought that to bear, which is looking at what immigration does to the United States. Now, of course, what workers in America worry about is that if there's a lot more immigrants, that will reduce their wages or lose them their jobs. They also worry beyond that about community change, and that if you get large numbers of immigrants who are very different from you, that may change the place in which you live. So economists have spent a lot of time looking at the former, and there's one very famous study called the Mariel boat lift, when Fidel Castro in Cuba opened up his jails and sent a huge number of prisoners to Florida and just dumped them there. And the American took them in because they were refugees from Fidel Castro and so on. So David Card, for one, and others subsequently, have looked at whether that reduced wages. And they basically found very little. Didn't seem to reduce the wages of the people who were there. So this work, which is good work, has been extrapolated into saying that, you know, immigrants don't hurt domestic wages. And they don't look at the long run. You know, the long run tends to be, so well, in the long run, everything will wash out and it's not important anyway. So there's very little literature on that. But in the history literature, for instance, by historians, there's one analysis is that, you know, we had this situation in the United States where basically in the middle of the 20th century, we didn't really have any immigration at all. There was huge immigration in the late 19th century. There is again now. But there was basically a ban up until about 1970, very, very few immigrants. That was also the period where the Great Migration took place, where African Americans moved from the South to the factories here in Philadelphia and Chicago and New York and so on. And the story is that those factory owners would actually much prefer to have hired Serbs or Germans or Italians. But they couldn't because there was a complete ban on immigration. And so that created enormous opportunities for African Americans to have better lives, to move to the north, and really changed American history. That would not be picked up by anything that we've looked at, and there's very extensive literature in economics that looks at that. So we're not taking that broader picture. And you know, when I tell you that story, you could say, well, any number of other things could have happened. That's not convincing, and that's what my economist colleagues would say. They said, that's history, you know, it's anecdote, it's just a story. But what's happened is we've become much more rigorous in the way we look at evidence, and then we've thrown away all the history. And I think historians are actually better at thinking about causal things than economists are, because economists are very narrow about it, and you have to do it my way or no way or the highway and all that sort of stuff. Whereas historians know that, that causality is contingent, it's complicated, and they think about that. And I've always found that, I've recently found that story very convincing. So this stuff which I was very enamored of, these tight causality testing, ways of getting convincing evidence, I think we were too enamored of, and we're going to have to back away from that and let the history in and talk to historians when we're not busy talking to philosophers, you know, because they know stuff too.
What other stories do you think need to be reconsidered?
Well, something that's very being taught now is that we thought globalization was great, and you know, we thought foreign aid was great. I'm sure globalization has done really good things, but yeah, a lot of people will tell you the huge reduction in global poverty came about because of globalization. I think people are telling other stories about that now too. A lot of the poverty reduction was in India, and India doesn't really export much, so that didn't happen. China did export a huge amount, but if they'd consumed more there, they could have still grown very rapidly. And then maybe we wouldn't have got so much job loss in the United States. So, and I think, you know, I've spent a fair amount of time over the years working with the World Bank, and certainly the sort of international civil servants in Washington will tell you that, okay, Americans lost their jobs, and they were impoverished a bit, but they were much richer than the people in China anyway. So the world is a better place because these people in China, who were much poorer to start with, were pulled up, and these people here were lost. But I think you have a quote, if I remember, tell me if I got this wrong, about that they said it's like eminent domain. I mean, the government has come and taken away my job to give foreign aid to China, right? So it's sort of like involuntary foreign aid by American workers to China. Now, you could argue philosophically that might be a transfer from richer people to poorer people, but you know, the people in China don't vote in American elections, whereas the ones in America are liable to come after you with pitchforks. And we didn't take that into account.
The premise in America was that it was going to be good for Americans. There was a redistributive agenda on the back end of these policies that didn't ever come to fruition. I think Joseph Stiglitz has observed that the promise was always there, but the reality never was.
Right.
And you write in the book that maybe we need to stop talking so much about redistribution and start talking more about pre-distribution, that ought to be the focus of efforts to reduce inequalities. What does a pre-distributive agenda look like?
I think it's just being much more careful about those sort of things and not having this monomaniacal focus on economic efficiency. And, economists said, well, it's our job to improve efficiency. It's our job to improve national income. And it doesn't really matter who benefits and who gets hurt along the way. But what turns out, of course, is it's always the same people who benefit. And it's always the same people who get hurt. And economists used to think that the people who got hurt would come around in the end, but it's never really clear that that's been the case. And it's become much harder because people who've lost their jobs in a manufacturing town in, say, North Carolina or something, the recommendation of economists, well, go to some successful city like New York or San Francisco or something, but you can't afford to live there. And so mobility has really fallen a lot. Binyamin had a wonderful piece in the New York Times, 3 weeks ago, about how the way they've engineered Tokyo is such that people of modest means, say who are running a small restaurant, can afford to rent or buy a place in about half of Tokyo's precincts. And in none of New York's precincts would that be possible, for instance. So that, we paralyze people in place, taking their jobs away and give them nothing else to do.
There was a belief for a long time that education was, sort of the dominant strategy for driving increased prosperity. It figures in your account, The Great Escape, as an engine of upward mobility. It has long been, sort of central to, policy here in the United States, this idea that if we educate people. So one read of your work is that if people die early without college degrees, get them into colleges. Get them degrees, they'll have access to a better life. One thing I take from the work of Claudia Goldin, who just joined you in the pantheon of laureates, is that education wasn't enough to fully improve the economic standing of women. There are constraints on how much that ends up delivering. Is that more broadly true? Have we maxed out on the benefits of education as a strategy?
I'm not sure maxed out is as far as I would go that far. And, I'm a professor. I've been a professor for a long time. My father, who started life as a coal miner and then was drafted into the Army, the British Army, in 1939, fought his whole life subsequently to get education. And that really paid off for him and me and for my children. So I don't want to beat up on education for a minute. But the idea that these deaths, which are so structured by education, would be cured by educating everybody, I don't think is really true. One of the stories that Anne and I have been telling is that, there's a lot of arbitrary exclusion of people without BAs who can't get work because you have to check a box saying, do you have a BA or not? And if you don't check that box, you don't get any, you're not even interviewed. They don't look at you anymore. And I think people are realizing that that doesn't make a lot of sense. And I know Governor Shapiro in Pennsylvania has pushed that very hard so that I think it's 92% of state workers in Pennsylvania do not require BA anymore. In some other states, and quite a number of private employers. I think Merck and IBM and other places have said, we'll hire based on qualifications for the job and not arbitrary qualifications, which makes a lot of sense to me. There's got to be a lot of people who can write computer code, you know, who can do lots of good stuff without having a college degree. I once talked to someone at Google and said, you know, how many of your people there don't have a BA? And he said, oh, lots of them. And I said, what do they do? He said, they're genius programmers. We hire them out of high school. You know. Okay, there are not too many of those.
I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience. So start thinking about what you would like to ask Angus. We'll get to you in just a minute. My last question is about hope. A number of years ago, I was in Minneapolis working on a story about housing. Minneapolis is a city that has sought to make some policy changes to make it easier to build housing there. And one of the things that I heard from several members of the city council was that they thought they had a limited opportunity to act because there was still a middle class in Minneapolis. And once that disappeared, they would be in the same political predicament as the coastal states, unable to address inequality because there was no longer a center to vote for the policies that were necessary. Have we lost our chance? Is it too late to do this? I know this takes us beyond the realm of economics and into politics, but do you have hope that we can solve these problems?
I think we're going to have to. And I think, what is it that founders believe? The middling class of people. If you don't have a middling class of people, the whole thing is lost, because you have oligarchs on one hand and poor people on the other hand, and this incredible division that we have today. And this middling class, I think the term probably comes from Hume or Smith or something. It's certainly part of the Scottish Enlightenment, that those are the people that we have to have that make things work. They're educated enough so that, you know, they can participate in this sort of stuff, but they're not oligarchs, they're not very rich people, and they have a real chance of making this work. And we need more of that. So good luck to Minnesota and anyone else, Minneapolis, and anyone else who's going to try to do this. Thank you.
Oh, actually, your first Nobel laureate, I have a chance to ask a question. How your life changed since you won Nobel Prize, and did you feel like people change attitude towards you since that happened?
Your life changes very quickly for a few days. You know, after you get the phone call, there was a reporter on our lawn about 15 minutes later. It wasn't entirely clear how he got there. And it's certainly true, you get a lot of emails from Nigeria suggesting that you donate part of your winnings to building a house for this poor gentleman who could build himself a beautiful house. You get a lot of invitations to speak, but I'm not sure it changed our lives. Well, I tell you one way in which it changed my life. I decided to retire 2 days before the phone call came. And we made a very hard decision. We didn't know whether we had enough money to do that. And we sat down and counted the beans and decided that we had about enough. And that would have been a much easier decision if I'd known that 2 days later someone was going to call me up and give me $1 million. But, you know, I think I've just been very fortunate. Most of the work we've been talking about here, about the mortality of people without a college degree, that was work that Anne and I started doing not after the prize, but immediately before the prize. So that paper was published, I think, 6 days a week after. The first paper in the sequence was published a week after the prize was announced. And the prize changed our life a lot, but not as much as that paper did. So I felt, very lucky that, you know, it's not usual for people to have the chance to work on a whole new productive avenue so late in life. I think that was a great gift to me. And also it did I'm not sure it detracted, but one of the nice traditions they used to have, and I think they've started up again, is that Nobel laureates go to the White House and meet the president in the Oval Office. And President Obama was then president, and we went in, and there were two really wonderful things that happened. One is Anne was right behind my shoulder, and I said, Mr. President, I'd like to introduce you, and he said, Professor Case needs no introduction to me. I'm a great fan of her work. She fell in love at that moment. And then when we went in, he had read the paper, which had been published 3 or 4 days before, and he wanted to talk about it in detail, all the way down to the footnotes. You know, you can take the professor out of the University of Chicago and put him into the White House, but he's still a professor. And of course, that was a really wonderful thing to happen. So the short answer to the question is, given that we had this whole new line of work, it was like being a kid all over again, and the Nobel Prize became sort of irrelevant. Well, irrelevant is too big a word, but it was not such a big deal.
It's wonderful to, I must say I haven't read any of your books, but it's wonderful to listen and learn about you. I graduated from Princeton with a degree in economics, where I learned why they call it the dismal science. with it, and for me, it just didn't appeal because it was all about numbers. In you're talking about, you know, the tension between capital and labor, which is where I think capitalism has gotten a bad name, and yet we need markets. And so what I've been studying is the issue of currency and money, and the need to redesign our current Federal Reserve fiat money system. You know, I saw just a couple of weeks ago that Saudi Arabia is now part of the BRICS countries, and it seems like there's going to be some competition, worldwide competition for to be the world's reserve currency. And I wonder what you might think about that, and how you might think it could affect some of the issues about poverty that you're so familiar with.
That's a really interesting question. I find it hard to draw a direct line in that. I think America as a whole certainly benefits from being the reserve currency. It's also true that, that we're living in a much more multipolar world, but I don't think the Saudis would be the first in line to try and be the world currency. The Fed is a very complicated institution. You know, it's not under full democratic control. And again, that's something that maybe economists, where economists probably differ. I think most economists think it's a good idea that it's not under democratic control, because, you know, you would have Jim Jordan and Steve Scalise controlling the currency, which might not be your idea of an optimal monetary policy. On the other hand, you know, there's really very little accountability, certainly in the short run. So you could argue about that. The Federal Reserve was instituted as an anti-inequality measure to some extent. It's part of all the reforms that took place in the progressive era. And the idea was to get money out from under J.P. Morgan and the oligarchs who otherwise were, you know, brought in every time there was a financial crisis. So this, it really is, I don't even know where I sit on this, but I know some of those arguments. So work on it, sir, really important.
Hi, thank you for being here. You referenced Matthew Desmond, who was actually here a few months ago, and he— Sorry,
who? I didn't—
Matthew Desmond.
Oh, Matt, yeah.
And he talked, too, about the idea that economics and our policymaking is data-driven and not focused on people. So as a professor, what ways do you think programs can help kind of step back from the data a little bit and focus on social justice and other areas that are important?
It's interesting because I don't think of data as being the, the enemy of social justice. I think, you know, the undata-based attachment to outworn theories, you know, libertarianism, for instance, which believes that the government can't do any good at all, is a much greater enemy than data. And Matt lives on data. I mean, Matt, you know, he collected all these data and evicted, and, you know, all power to him. I thought that was an absolutely marvelous book. But I do think that there was this sense, I'll give you one example of libertarianism. My friend Jim Heckman did a wonderful podcast a couple of weeks back, and he talked about the best paper he's ever written. And the best paper he's ever written, he went to the Carolinas to look at the effects of civil rights legislation on narrowing the gap between black wages and white wages. And he found a substantial effect. And he actually spent a lot of time down there, so he did all these good things. He collected data, he talked to the unions, he talked to the leaders in the community, all the rest of it, brought it all together in what he thought was a super convincing piece. And he gave a talk at the University of Chicago. And George Stigler, who was one of the great luminaries in Chicago, said to him, "You're not serious, are you?" And Jim said, "I'm very serious. This is the best empirical work he's ever done." But he said, and George Stigler said, "But it's wrong." And he said, "What do you mean it's wrong?" He said, "The government can't possibly help people. We know that." So you may think this is a joke, but that was the view in perhaps the most influential school of economics, you know, in the 20th century. And his chairman told him the same thing. And, you know, it was just, what really offended Jim was not that the government could help. It was them telling him that this was not an appropriate topic for empirical research. So they wanted the data out of it because they weren't going to believe anything the data said, and it was pointless too. And I think we've broken that a little bit. But, you know, we have to have a serious discussion about what government can and cannot do. I mean, one of the great things that Chicago did for us was to tell us that government's not always the answer, and government can be the problem too. But the idea that the government can never help, I think, is just crazy, and it's cursed us.
I'm reminded, I'm forgetting his name at the moment, but there was a Yale economist who wrote a very important paper about the reluctance of companies to cut wages, why companies don't do that. And he begins the paper by observing that he's employed an unusual methodological strategy. He has interviewed workers.
Yeah, that was Truman Bewley.
Yes, yeah,
absolutely. Right. A great man. He was a theorist, so he wasn't stuck with all these conventions that you could only use data that come from government sources or something. Yeah. He went out and looked for himself.
Yes, hi, and thanks for being here. I teach at the Wharton School at Penn, and I recently read a biography of Albert Hirschman that was in Princeton Press. And my question has to do, it seemed that by reading that biography, that there was a turn in the economics profession around that time when Hirschman was at Harvard, and then there were battles about who was going to get tenure, et cetera. And I just wonder if you had some recollections about, first, the history by which economics has come to the state that you're diagnosing, but especially what recommendations do you have for how that might change back to, so in a way that would allow economists to take into account history and other disciplines as you're recommending.
This is Jeremy Edelman's biography of Albert Hirschman. Yeah, it's a great book, and Albert was a good friend of mine. And he was as generous as economists that you're talking about were not. I mean, I was hired, I came to Princeton, he was at the Institute. He was what Albert was, you know all about Albert. I was a trained mathematician who was doing econometrics and was thinking about development through data. And we could not have been further apart in the tools we used. But he was unbelievably kind and befriended me and made it clear that there was room for me as well as him at the same time. But one of the stories that it was clear that his work was deeply unfashionable in economics at the time, which is one of the reasons that he never got the Nobel Prize, and which I think Jeremy, to some extent, wrote that book to make the case that, Albert really deserved a Nobel Prize and had done many wonderful things over his life. There's a wonderful piece by Paul Krugman, which you can find online, about Albert Hirschman. And he makes the analogy that about maps. And this tells you a lot about economics in mid-century, which is if you look at medieval maps of Africa, no one really knew anything what was there. And they were full of details, most of which was made up. So it would be, say, here be monsters. There was a picture of a monster or something, and here be, and there were rivers that didn't exist, and some of the rivers did, and some of them didn't, and these were wonderful maps. And then the standards changed. You weren't allowed to do that anymore. You had to have maps that were properly surveyed, and people could see all the details, and they'd been justified and all the rest of it. So suddenly, around the middle of the 19th century, these maps of Africa just go blank, right? There's nothing there because nothing met the standards. And then slowly, with good mensuration and, expeditions and all the rest of it, the maps were filled in, and the dragons and the monsters were replaced by actual real things. And Paul was making the point that that was progress, right? And that Albert was belonging to the dragons and monsters age, and what mid-century economics was doing was getting itself on a sound empirical basis. I doubt if Paul would defend that anymore, and that, Albert's things were not monsters. They were real things, but not cast in the technical language of mid-century economics. Will we ever get back there again? I think so. There's one very good thing about economics, which is it's very open. You don't have to wait to be 65 to get a professorship. Young, smart people who do new, different things get tenure at Harvard when they're 25 years old. And, or can. I'm not saying they always do. But, and there are professions where you really have to wait until you're on the verge of retirement before you get to be a senior person. And economics is not like that. So that means it does change very fast. And if I think of how it's changed over the last 40 years, it's changed hugely. It's a completely different subject in some ways. So, the things that Adam Smith raised, we still worry about, but we worry about in different ways. And so I think this paying more attention to history, to philosophy, and so on will come. And I'm trying to do my bit to help it along.
That's an excellent optimistic note on which to end our evening. We are out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.